This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Joining me for this episode of the podcast is Anthony Tallman, co-founder and head brewer for Burgeon Brewing. Welcome to the podcast, Anthony.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
If I'm thinking about it, I think my first visit to Burgeon, and maybe my only visit to Burgeon, was 2017. I think it was within the first 6 to 12 months that you guys were open. And Matthew had been sending us some beer. And I was coming down for when we did a brewery accelerator down here in San Diego that year. And I was driving between LA and San Diego. And just had a little extra time and stopped through. We may have met. My memory is foggy of those times.
We might have, yeah. That was quite some time ago.
Those were early days, and there's been a lot of beers between here and there. In the meantime, you have made quite a splash here in a very busy and a very high-performance beer culture here in San Diego. A lot of award winners here in San Diego, and yet, Carlsbad Crush, a beer that we're drinking right now, has won several silver medals at the Great American Beer Festival, and most recently this past year in the International Style Pale Ale category. Amongst brewers, you're well respected as a brewer of West Coast IPA, West Coast Pale Ale, West Coast Pilsner, and I think we're going to talk about all three of those things over the course of this episode of the podcast. But first, G&D Chillers, they always strive to build great chillers. Partner with them as you build great beer. Andy Joint of Big Grove Brewery says, quote, "We've been using G&D Chillers from the beginning, from our original 3.5 barrel pub system to our production brewery. We've been able to rely on G&D to provide a high quality chiller, help us with design and layout, and provide support wherever we need it," end quote. Choose G&D Chillers on your next expansion or brewery startup and receive 1 free year of remote control and monitoring of your new G&D chiller. Also, turnkey brewery systems, production line design services, retrofitting processing systems. ProBrew can do all of this and more with any brewery, old or new, small or large. With an expansive list of breweries already served, their engineering team prides itself on providing a true turnkey solution built for your entire production line that can be easily customized to fit your operation. For more information, fill out their contact form at www.probrew.com or email contactus@probrew.com to learn exactly how they can take your operations to the next level. ProBrew, brew your beer. And you might have heard of Old Orchard, but have you heard of their newest flavors? Berry Blend, Blood Orange, Lemonade, and Tart Cherry are the latest additions to their lineup of flavored craft juice concentrate blends. Old Orchard's R&D team can also formulate custom blends unique to your needs. To learn more and request your free samples, head on over to oldorchard.com/brewer. All right, Anthony, we normally start off the podcast with a little bit of background. So why don't you walk us through your brewing background? What steps did you take to get to where you are now, founding and now leading the brewing side of Burgeon Beer?
Yeah, so I always kind of thought there was 2 initial paths for people to take, and that was either getting into a brewing school or I guess picking up homebrewing as a hobby, and for me that was the road I chose to go down. Good friend of mine, some odd years back, her dad had been a homebrewer for I think 25 years at the time, and just kind of said, "Hey, we're having a big birthday barbecue for Kelly. You want to come over and brew a beer with me and learn some stuff, clean some stuff, and see what you think." Took the one batch to get hooked and immediately started buying my own equipment. Later turned into doing one brew by myself. My best friend, who's one of my business partners, Derek, he's our third partner. So Derek, Matthew, and myself. Derek and I started homebrewing together every single weekend. Pretty much when I turned 21, I started applying at Stone Brewing Company, trying to get my foot in the door. And I think it took about 3 interviews to finally get hired, and kind of worked my way up from the bottom. Started on the keg line, cleaning, washing kegs, eventually filling kegs. Never had to work on the bottling line, so didn't end up going down that route. But just took in what I could and learned from coworkers and trainers and supervisors there, and that carried on to a couple other brewing jobs at different breweries, and later in 2016 founded Burgeon Beer Company.
What was the drive to start your own brewery?
I kind of always had this inclination that I wanted to own my own company or work for myself. I don't know. I'm pretty type A and like things, like to be in charge and do things my way and all that.
Sure.
But I'm pretty ambitious, and I would consider myself to have a pretty high work ethic. And there just wasn't anything that I had found up to that point that I was so drawn in by. I mean, there was jobs I knew I could have and I'd be fine with, and I'd make a decent wage and all that. But I was in college at the time, and I had been working at the local YMCA for, I don't know, probably at least 5 years at that point, if not longer. And brewing drew me in so easily and so fast, and it just kind of was a nice blend of the creative side of things and the science side of things and understanding why and how certain processes would change things. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I've almost felt like it was in my blood.
It's a tough market to then just, walk into here in San Diego because there's a lot of experienced brewers. There's a lot of expectation if you're going to, it's one of the more crowded brewing markets in the entire world, in terms of breweries per capita. How did you all, as you launched Burgeon, set about creating beer that was going to be noteworthy or, gain an audience here in San Diego? And you all are in the far north of San Diego County in Carlsbad, but I should say you have multiple locations throughout San Diego County. But even then, that was a competitive area. There's great breweries like Lost Abbey, Pizza Ports and stuff up there. Now world class breweries in your relatively immediate area.
Yeah, absolutely. On one hand, I feel so fortunate to have grown up in an area with world-class beer that you're speaking of, because those were definitely all the places that I did and still do continue to drink beer at. And I think as the passion grew stronger for me, and like I said at the time, Derek, we were homebrewing together, all the great beer we had around us, I think it only just pushed us to want to strive to make as good a beer, if not better, if that was possible for us. So Derek and I homebrewed for probably 10 years together before we actually got to the point of opening Burgeon. It was close to 10 years. And Matthew, my third partner, he was not in the industry whatsoever. He was just kind of a craft beer fan. He was working a sales job at the time. I was brewing at Rough Draft Brewing Company in kind of the Mira Mesa area, and it was his territory. He came in and liked what he was having. Kind of, we went to high school together, so he ended up shooting me a text and rekindled a friendship, I guess, and kind of pitched the idea to me to start it off. And I kind of said, hey, I've been doing this with Derek on the side, and we've already been talking about wanting to get our own thing going. If you're serious about it, then the three of us need to meet, because I'm not going to do it without him, basically, is what I said to him. And Matt was very serious about it and had already kind of seeked out interest, and from the financial side of things, I guess. We were probably 2+ years in the planning to get to opening, and started in Carlsbad, and now we're working on our 5th location.
So what was the idea for the beer that you were going to make?
We pretty much brewed a little bit of everything when we were homebrewing. Obviously, growing up here and being accustomed to great West Coast hop forward beer, we knew we wanted to have a focus on that. We also had this notion of not wanting to, we didn't want to have somebody come in and not be able to find something that they wanted to drink. So, having a diverse list was pretty important to us. Our opening list was probably only about 5 beers when we first opened, but it ranged from a hoppy rye amber ale, a cream ale, West Coast IPA. Actually, I think we had 2 West Coast IPAs. I'm blanking on what the 5th beer was, but
I recall a brown ale from you back in that era, even too. I know that we had one at one point, but you also were making hazy IPA even in North County, San Diego, back in 2016, 2017.
Yeah, our very first can release, which was May of 2017, was actually 2 hazy beers, which was such a new territory for, I think, San Diego as a whole, and very particularly for us. Giant learning curve brewing that type of a beer, coming from very clean, crisp, bitter hoppy forward West Coast beers. Lots of sleepless nights and definitely handfuls of dumped batches that we were not happy with and trying to figure out why things happened. Yeah, that style has actually slowed down a bit for us, which, selfishly I'm not opposed to.
Seems like it's happening that way for most people these days, or at least most in the western half of the country. Even for our readers, even our reader survey most recently, that hazy IPA, it's still up there, but dropped down a little bit versus even Pilsner. Pilsner took over the number 2 spot in our reader survey from hazy IPA. I don't know what that really means, if that's just our crazy subset of brewer audience that maybe is leading the consumer market a little bit in that sense, but interesting enough to see that maybe some of that momentum is at least slowing. Well, let's talk about West Coast IPA, or let's just start talking about West Coast Pale Ale and IPA, because that is again something that's close to your heart, something you grew up drinking and homebrewing, and something that you all have won plenty of awards for. Before we do that, streamline efficiency with Omega Yeast Diacetyl Knockout Series. The DKO series is comprised of 8 familiar yeast strains engineered to knock out the formation of diacetyl before it starts. The strains now better. Available now for made-to-order pitchables at any volume. Contact Omega Yeast today at omegayeast.com. Also, ABS Commercial has been a full-service brewery outfitter for 10 years. They are proud to offer brewhouses, tanks, keg washers, and preventative maintenance parts to brewers across the country, as well as equipment for distilling, cider making, wine making, and more. They know the ins and outs of the brewing and installation process and can design the perfect setup for you, whether you're just starting out or looking to expand. Contact them today at sales@abs-commercial.com to discuss your customized brewery needs. ABS Commercial, we are brewers. So to make a splash in West Coast IPA, West Coast style pale ale here in San Diego, the beers, they have to be lean, they have to be relatively dry, they also have to have a vivid hop character, but also, they also have to have a drinkability to them. As you started thinking about how you were going to make extremely high quality West Coast IPA, because that's exactly what you have to make to be able to sell it or to build accounts here in San Diego. Where did you start, and maybe walk us through some of the evolution over the last 6 years, because this has also evolved very significantly over just a 6-year period. It's strange to think about it in those terms, right? But
yeah.
If you think about where you were in 2016, 2017, and where you are now in West Coast IPA, walk us through some of that evolution.
Yeah, it has drastically changed. I think not only as a whole, but for us in particular. And we're always striving to figure out ways to make our beers, more aromatic and cleaner, and stand out and just have that punch that everybody's looking for. I mean, if I correctly think back on some of the aspects of the recipe of the very first West Coast beer we put out, which was called Thuja, there was probably 4 malts and 3 hops, and we literally fermented with French ale yeast, which I don't know if that even is in existence anymore. But, that was kind of us in the beginning trying to put out something a little different than what was going on, because at that time, I almost think the craft beer landscape was a little bit more cutthroat at that time than maybe it even is now here. But I mean, now, modern day speaking, like even Trivana, our flagship IPA, it's down to 2 malts, 2 hops, super neutral yeast strain, nothing, out of the ordinary on that. So our approach has drastically changed, and maybe even more so in the last 2 years.
Yeah. What's happened in the last 2 years?
I think we've just leaned things out. We've drinkability has always been a big focus for us. We're most recently seeing a bit of a shift towards lower alcohol hoppy beers, which I think are playing a little bit of a hand in on even some of the West Coast beers that are higher alcohol percentage. But yeah, I mean, I'm just personally looking for the ultimate session beer, and taking that perspective even when it comes to something like Trivana that's 7.2%. But we have such a big following for that beer and a pretty big distribution footprint. But I think that also, that approach is also what's helping that beer do what it's doing.
This explains why so many West Coast IPA brewers are focused on West Coast Pilsner these days, so they can make the hoppy beers that they want to drink in the same kind of quantity that they want to drink them. But I want to stay on IPA for a little while.
Okay.
Let's talk about how you today, in 2024 now, as you're constructing a West Coast IPA recipe, where do you start? When you say you've leaned it out, obviously that means you are looking for lighter and lower flavor contribution malt and grains. Where do you start building up a recipe then?
Yeah, so we've actually been putting a lot of focus into that particularly. So we have 2 grain silos. We purchased a second one recently that is an outdoor silo, much larger. So that does contain our 2-row, but we want to convert our indoor silo into a pilsner silo. We're trying to find that balance of a pilsner malt.
Indoor silo. You must have. Actually, I've been to that warehouse brewing spaces. It's actually you. At the time, had a decent amount of space in there. I imagine it's a little tighter now.
Looks a little different, yeah.
I remember you had built on a brew deck that had a space for another vessel at that point. So I imagine some things have changed since then.
Yeah, quite a bit. But yeah, we've kind of been trialing different pilsner malts lately. So 3 of our 6 core beers are lager style beers. So we're trying to find a pilsner malt that would be suitable for those. But also we've been brewing a lot of hoppy beers with pilsner malt, and that's kind of what I was alluding to by leaning it out. Referring back to Trivana, our flagship West Coast, that is a 2-row based beer. But we do 2 new beers in cans every 2 weeks. So lots of new stuff is always happening, which allows for us to trial different malts. And I would say that the majority of the one-off West Coast beers we put out now are Pilsner-based, or at least a high percentage of. For example, Raw North Star has been a great malt to mess around with. It's got that really lean, clean body, but still kind of provides the head retention that I'm looking for. And pretty much no specialty. We use a acidulated malt to adjust pH, and some beers they'll have small percentages of pale wheat malt in it, but other than that, that's pretty much where we're at.
How do you think about that difference and make decisions between, say, 2-row and a pilsner malt and an IPA?
I think at the time when we came up with Trivana, brewing IPAs or like very hoppy forward beers with pilsner malt was like just happening, so it really wasn't on our minds. And we were just thinking like, okay, 2-row is a little bit more versatile for other styles we want to brew with. And certain applications where pilsner might not be the right malt to choose. But now that we've got a little bit more flexibility with the 2 silos, and again, just this hyper rotation of 2 new beers every 2 weeks, it's really allowed us to dial in, aiming for not only like obviously the hop profiles are the main thing with these beers, but obviously aiming for some kind of a malt, component, or focusing on that aspect as well, whether that's dumbing it down or making it a focal point.
But I guess what I'm trying to say is you could still brew all of your IPAs with 2-row, but you also are now incorporating pilsner malt into some of your IPAs, not your core, obviously, but but maybe some of the specialty. Am I hearing you right when you say that?
Yeah.
So why then make the selection between those 2 things? What is it about specific ideas that you have with some of these, special or one-off IPAs that's going to drive you towards this pilsner malt? And is there something about, the pilsner malt that you choose that, either complements the hops that you're using for those, or, that helps you accomplish some other goal, or even, in some senses maybe heightens sulfur, or, works with that fermentation process? What's the decision-making process around it?
I think ultimately, and most importantly, we've noticed that it just circles back around to that drinkability aspect. Not that I wouldn't say Trivana is not, a highly drinkable IPA, but it's definitely not anywhere near as sessionable as some of these other beers that we've been able to focus and make tweaks on, as far as some of the one-off stuff we've been doing. I think above everything, that's just what I always circle back to.
Sure. Well, what is it about? You mentioned that that head retention and flavor of raw North Star pills, and hearing a lot more brewers, leaning on that. How does that work? Obviously, if you're filling up a silo of it, which is your intention there, it needs to work for both the lagers that you make, which also involve West Coast style lagers, There is some of that hoppy crossover there, but they also has to work within your, say, non-West Coast style lagers that you also make. How did you determine, did you settle on that as some sort of medium between the hoppy beers that you make and some of the more traditional style lagers?
So we've been working with BSG specifically for quite some time now, and I think we originally started with Gambrinus pills, and we started bringing pallets of that malt and incorporating into different hoppy beers. And we kind of noticed with that malt particularly that the beers seemed to dry out a little bit more.
Yeah.
So there was almost like
I hear a lot of that these days.
It was almost like pushing the boundary of that, not the drinkability, but like, I don't know, the dryness led to, for me at least, it not being too drinkable because it was like overly dry, like not brewed IPA dry, but like going in that direction. So I don't know, we kind of quickly found that malt wasn't really suitable for what we were looking to do. And I think after Gambrinus, we were already using Weyermann premium pills for the base of all of our lagers, so we started to experiment with that in hoppy beers and had really good results. The unfortunate side of that malt particularly, or maltster in general, is that we cannot get silo fills of it because that would be my clear decision. But that led us to trialing RAR North Star. It was a new malt at the time, or a new offering from BSG, and initially incorporated it into some hoppy beers at lower percentages than maybe what we're doing now, just to kind of see how it would change things. And now that we're in the position where we're trying to dial in, kind of one malt for all type of deal, we've been doing test batches with our 3 core lagers and then trialing RAR's premium pills as well. We haven't finalized the decision yet, but North Star seems to be kind of the direction I'm leaning.
Yeah. Why that compared to some of the other pills?
The few batches we've done lately of our core lagers with premium pills, they seemed to have like the slightest darker color pickup over North Star. I mean, when you look at the specs just on the website, they're pretty comparative. I mean, you're talking like a couple tenths of Lovabond in either direction, but just for us, it's just like pour a pint visually in the glass. It's kind of got more of a hue to it. I don't know.
And the San Diegans want it light, or they want it a little bit more golden?
I think people are definitely in the direction of light.
Yeah. There's, you've got to brew beers for your audience. And so even if I want more color and body and my lager, doesn't mean that that's what's going to sell for you all. No, that's interesting. Do you ever vary that malt based on hops that you're using?
We haven't really yet. I would say, though, that some of the beers we've done recently definitely...
That's the old Zach via Evan, kind of, a pathway there, level of wonkiness. I'm just curious about it.
I know that, I'm familiar with that.
You're playing in the same field, right?
Yeah. I've noticed that with certain hops that, in my opinion, lean more towards the pungent side, Riwaka, Nelson, I would even put 586 in there, maybe Mosaic to a certain extent. I almost prefer a touch more of that malt backbone, I think.
Yeah.
Like, for example, we did a beer about not quite a year ago with Win from Wondrous. It was 100% Weyermann premium pills, and it was Riwaka and Mosaic, and it was like almost too lean for that hop profile. So It was a little bit whacked out on the balance for me. So in that case, something like a RAR North Star might have been more of a suitable Pilsner base.
Sure. Well, let's walk back. We've built a malt base for this. As you're thinking about, designing one of these, special IPAs for your normal every other week's, schedule. You build a malt base. Where do you go from there?
I would say our hopping schedules have changed a little bit lately. For a while, we actually, when our beers were all 2-row or predominantly 2-row, we had a lot of beers that were like 30-minute boils only, and we would do a first wort hop edition and whirlpool only. I think we're kind of starting to realize that there just wasn't enough layering involved, And so, several of those recipes have changed since then. And we've been trialing that more so with the one-off beers before we make any tweaks to anything in the core realm. But yeah, I mean, now we're kind of back to 60-minute boils, still sticking with the first word additions, just kind of like that bitterness that brings in.
What do you use for first word?
That depends on the beer. I mean, we're not traditional in the sense of, we don't do any sort of like an extract just to get the BUs or have like a specific varietal.
High alpha.
No,
Okay.
yeah, which, I mean, that's kind of how it came up through Stone. It was,
Sure.
we were like Warrior or Magnum, and that's how we're going to lay our bitterness base.
Right.
No, so yeah, I mean, like Trivana, for example, that's an Amarillo first wort. It really just kind of depends on the profile and, what we're looking to get out of the hot side.
When you say what you're trying to get out of the hot side, what are you? If you use Amarillo, as a first wort hop, what are you trying to get out of that? Because that's now cooking for a long time, 60 minutes, through that whole process.
Yeah, so I like the typical alpha acid range for Amarillo. I say Amarillo. I know everybody says Amarillo. I don't know. It's like it's a Spanish word in my head. Okay. So but yeah, I like the IBU or the alpha acid range on that hop from year to year. It's typically in like the 7 to 10%, so it's not super high. I don't think we're getting like too much of an aggressive bitterness with that first word addition. We're obviously paying a little bit more attention to that hop from year to year because it's in our main core beer. But really, we always kind of worked backwards, like whirlpool back. With being able to do a little bit lower of a BU addition on the first wort with something like Amarillo, we can really pack in on the whirlpool side.
I love it that you work back from that. Talk to me about that process. So when you're building, I normally go linear and start at the front and walk through the end of it. But you're building a hop, recipe for a beer. Walk through the way you do it, starting with the whirlpool.
Yeah, I mean,
dry hop. Do you start with a dry hop and then go to whirlpool? I don't.
We have done that.
Yeah.
We actually did a really interesting beer several years back that we've rebrewed and definitely made changes to over the years. But it initially started out as like hey, let's see what we can do with a beer that's dry hop only and what that BU might come back at. And at the time, it was a beer we brewed with some old coworkers of mine from Stone. We had Stone test it, and it was literally dry hop only. It was a 30-minute boil, nothing on the hot side. About a 3 pound per barrel dry hop, and it came back at 49 IBUs.
Really?
Not to my palate,
right?
But that's
tested, not theoretical.
What it spit out,
not sensory, yeah.
And I think that kind of got the wheels turning. Not that when we write a recipe.
How did it test that high with that? You wouldn't think that dry hopping would add that much testable.
I was blown away, and I believe at the time that beer and that batch was like we dry hopped it at 50 degrees, and it wasn't like it was super active and warm during fermentation. Right. And like I said, we've changed that beer, the times that we have rebrewed it, and so I'd be intrigued to maybe retest it. I mean, we are doing some hot side hops on that beer now, but yeah, it was just an interesting experiment. I mean, it definitely lacked something. I mean, aromatically it was fantastic, but just it was lacking some of the mouthfeel. It obviously lacked some of the balance because it didn't have the true bitterness to it.
True bitterness.
Yeah, like bitterness that you can really like feel on the tongue.
Okay.
But that beer basically was what kind of got the wheels turning with like the whole working backwards thing.
Okay.
And I mean, when we write recipes now, it's not like I'm plugging in a dry hop and saying, "Oh, I'm getting 20 IBUs out of it." I don't calculate that in. I try to keep in mind like what we're using and maybe what kind of added punch that might be providing to the beer.
So you haven't adjusted your brewing software knowing that you're probably getting more BU contribution there in the dry hop?
No, we haven't done that. But yeah, I mean, I guess Whirlpool was always a huge focus for us. I mean, Carlsbad Crush, what we're drinking right now, is literally a Whirlpool only. This beer is still only a 30-minute boil. And, to my palate, has a pretty nice balanced bitterness to it.
Yeah.
But maybe that's why it, doesn't fit in that American pale category.
International style.
Yeah.
Just put enough mosaic in it, you can call it international style, right? That's what it is, right?
Yeah, mosaic cryo. Yep.
Yeah. Oh man. So, this is a Whirlpool only beer. Lots and lots of mosaic and mosaic cryo in the Whirlpool. Nothing earlier than that. But and yet a 30-minute boil. That seems like such a minimalist approach to making West Coast IPA.
Yeah, so full disclosure, this beer, when it was very, very first brewed, was intended to be a hazy beer. So that was where the whole whirlpool only idea first came from, and the short boil, because we knew we were trying to keep the bitterness down. And when we first brewed this beer, the dry hop portion of it was completely all at knockout. And at least my theory is, and it happened over and over again because we kept pushing it, trying to figure out why. I think the quantity at which we were dry hopping at the knockout stage was so heavy that it was what caused the beer to drop bright.
Right.
Because at the time we were using, a variant of London 3, and the first batch came out, and it was, nearly as bright as what you're looking at right now, but it was fantastic. But we couldn't figure out why it wasn't hazy. And so it took a few batches to kind of understand it a little bit better, and then it transitioned to let's just make it a West Coast Pale Ale because the flavor is fantastic. We can keep working with a clean yeast strain that we're very familiar with, and we're not trying to really figure out too much.
Right. And all the current science actually supports that finding too, that hopping that early or dry hopping that early could actually work against your haze stability. It's
and we really found that it was the rate at which we were doing it, because at the time, so it was basically 44 pounds of mosaic per turn off of our brew house, which is a 15-barrel brew house. We probably knock out about 19 barrels. So that 44 pound for 19 barrels was so heavy that it was just making the beer naturally look this bright for the most part. This beer now is still getting the same mosaic ratio on the dry hop, but it's on day 4 or day 5 of fermentation, and we're fermenting it with Cal now to obviously make it a true West Coast beer. But we still messed around with knockout hop additions on hazy beers to try to figure out what that threshold might be to where you can still get some of those attributes from a knockout addition, obviously without running the risk of the beer dropping bright on you. But I don't think there's anything we've done recently as far as hazy beers go that we've incorporated knockout hop additions. I think we've kind of convinced ourselves that we can get the same qualities out of those varieties when adding them on day 4 or day 5. It's just kind of the warmer temp was really the focus as to why we were doing that in the first place. But yeah, we were kind of hesitant to get away from that on Carlsbad Crush because we felt like we had just created this gem, obviously accidentally, but figured out how to tailor it to what we really wanted it to be. And so we when we switched it to Cal, we continued to do the knockout hop addition for a while because we felt like that was really the process that was giving it the aromas that we were getting out of it. And then we slowly convinced ourselves to trial it on dry hopping on day 4 and 5 at about 70 degrees and still coming up with the same results, thankfully, because then we could use the yeast off of it.
Sure. So then looking at it, knockout hop versus whirlpool hop, what would be the temperature difference there?
So for us, we're quite literally opening the manway to the fermenter and dumping hops in as we're sending word in.
Right into the tank at fermentation.
Yeah, okay, when we first created this beer, that would have been at 67 degrees with that strain particularly. With Cal beers, we ferment at 65. So now we aren't doing the knockout hop. But when that transitioned from London 3 variant to Cal, we were knocking out at about 65, get everything in on batch 1, seal it back up. Our standard fermentation, temperature profile is 65 degrees for about 2 days, and then we're ramping it up to 70 degrees after that point. So now this beer gets dry hopped with that same amount of mosaic at 70 degrees.
Whirlpooling then, now that you've moved all of that to whirlpool hopping, do you do any temperature adjustments in that whirlpool in order to, bring down and lower isomerization in the whirlpool?
Yeah, so we, all of our recipes are built to have a water back. Our brew house has the ability to water back with cold liquor or ambient water. Depending on what we're brewing, so something like this, we target about a 2-barrel top up. It would be all cold liquor, and we probably would fall within about the 187 range. Because it is a West Coast beer, and we've obviously changed lots of things over the years to focus on this beer specifically being West Coast. We're not trying to go too low, or too low, I should say.
Right.
With the whirlpool temp, like we do want some of that isomerization, especially because we aren't putting kettle hops in technically.
Sure.
We still target that with something like Trivana that is getting that first wort edition and a 15-minute edition prior to the whirlpool edition. But yeah, we basically target about a 2-barrel cold liquor top up on our West Coast beers. Hazy beers a little bit lower, like try to hit maybe more like the 180 mark.
I'm curious what obviously since you're doing this both ways, what the difference is between, say, a Trivana that has some of these intermittent hopping, pieces coming in during that hot side versus this all whirlpool side. I want to talk a little bit more about that, but first, SS Brewtech was founded by a group of home brewers and craft brewers dedicated to bringing an engineering-first approach to brewery equipment. SS brewhouses are used to formulate new beer recipes at some of the world's greatest breweries and are the cornerstone of many local breweries. To learn more about SS Brewtech's innovation list, head on over to ssbrewtech.com. And have you heard of Christian Hansen? They're the fermentation experts with over 100 years experience in dairy and wine. They're now bringing that knowledge of microbes to brewers with their Smart Bev range of frozen liquid yeast and freeze-dried bacteria. This portfolio allows for consistent performance at the brewery and produces a range of high-quality brews. Reimagine what your beer can be. Go to chr-hansen.com. That's chr-hansen.com to learn more on the Smart Bev line of products. Also, everyone's talking about the 2024 California Craft Beer Summit, March 12th through 14th in Sacramento. And with their speaker announcements, it's easy to see why. Kicking off the summit as keynote speaker is Rob Todd, the pioneer who built Allagash Brewing. Alongside him is the opening session is Christopher Shepard from Beer Marketers Insights with the latest industry insights in craft beer. Check out the full schedule at the website, cacraftbeersummit.com. All right, Anthony, I want to talk a little bit about this difference. Obviously, since you're doing it, like I said, you're doing it both ways. How would you define the difference in hop flavor, with some of this kind of more intermittent and maybe slightly more traditional hopping method versus an all whirlpool method? And does some of that change with the actual hops that you're choosing in each of the individual beers?
I think lots of things are varietal dependent. We use Mosaic quite a bit. We feel pretty familiar with that hop, whether it's hot side or cold side. So I guess we kind of use that as like our ballpark or our main reference point of where to start with, examining other varietals. One thing that always, I guess I was a little weary of with this beer specifically, or anything that was only whirlpool hopped, is just like shelf stability. We've been pretty fortunate that we're in a position where a lot of our beers don't make it to the point of concern, I guess, from myself and my standard. But I think the lower ABV hoppy beers we do, we almost have to put a little bit more attention into how we layer the hops to help those beers kind of have the legs that they might need. I was drinking Tinnies earlier. I'm not sure if you had one, but Tinnies was an XPA that we did with Balter Brewing out of Australia. And what we really learned... Scotty. Yeah, Scotty. He was so awesome. I had a blast brewing with him and learning from him. And, he really kind of shared his perspective on layering hops and, how that works in with, the grain bill we're trying to build to create enough body to back up the amount of hops we're putting in. It was probably one of the most fun collabs for me that I've done lately, because I just felt like I was actually brewing something pretty different than the way we typically do things, and I really felt like I learned a lot. I've always kind of been in the mindset of like, oh, well, let's like use a half a bag here because we're going to use the other half a bag, and we're not going to leave anything. And the hop additions with Tinnies, it was like, we had a first word addition that was literally a quarter a pound each on the two varietals, and it's like stuff that we've never done before. But yeah, he kind of like made me have that light bulb moment of like, all right, there really is something to layering hops, even if it's in super small quantities throughout the boil. We did mash hopping, we did first wort, we did a bittering edition, we did a 15-minute edition, we did a whirlpool, and we did 2 dry hops. and this was on a 5.3% beer. But it was like so drinkable and so flavorful that it kind of like made me throw some things out the window. So
if you compare it to, say a much more simple recipe strategy that you might typically take from a sensory standpoint, how do you describe it? I mean, yes, better, more nuanced, but are there some specific, pieces to it, that you find as you're tasting it?
Yeah, I think when the beer came out, Scotty actually came back into town, and we kind of did some side-by-sides with Tinnies and Crush, just because Carlsbad Crush was probably the most similar beer we had on tap to do that with. And Tinnies just seemed to have more depth to it, and we're probably on the last keg of it here, but it's been on tap for about 6 weeks, and I still think it's drinking nearly as fresh as it was 6 weeks ago. So it's kind of made me think, like, is there something we should be doing differently with Crush, even though it has become such a great beer and it's obviously done well for us on the accolade level. But again, always looking to figure out how to make our beers better, hoppier, fresher, all that. So I don't know. I think there were some things that I learned from the Tinnies brew that I could probably apply to something like this to lengthen its life, I guess.
Yeah, talk to me about that longevity. I think that's interesting to think about, that having more of a, maybe we shouldn't call it cooked hop, but a hot side hop flavor to it, and some of those flavor compounds that are created or steeled or otherwise, cooked, or even, with other compounds driven off through some of that heating process, volatilized. What do you think lends some of those flavor characteristics more longevity in IPA versus just a pure whirlpool approach?
I mean, it must have something to do with just embedding itself, deeper into the wort versus, something to do with embedding itself into the wort and at the temperatures that we're doing it at, just in comparison to something like a dry hop where it's more time, but it's at a different temperature. A lot of things are blowing off during fermentation. I guess we just haven't honed in enough as far as trialing things to understand, why the hot side hopping could potentially be, creating a more shelf-stable beer, at least from our perspective and what we brew. But we are distributing beers, in cans and kegs, so it's definitely a focus for us to make sure our beer's tasting as good as it can from the day it goes out the door to the last pint of the keg or the last 4-pack out of the case. But yeah, sure.
Well, let's talk a little bit about building hop blends. Obviously within this West Coast, both West Coast Pilsner and West Coast IPA and Pale Ale kind of spectrum, there's some commonalities between those. Obviously, you lean heavily on Mosaic. Lots of brewers do. General go-to there. You all use a fair amount of New Zealand hops in your blends, whether it's West Coast IPA or West Coast Pilsner for that matter. You've got a pretty standard brand of a New Zealand Pilsner here. Talk to me about how you, creatively build those blends and, how you then think about layering hops in order to build a cohesive flavor out of some of these hop families.
Yeah, we definitely been brewing a lot more West Coast Pilsners lately, which has been fun from, one side of it. It's great to see the consumer wanting the lower alcohol but still hop-focused beers. I think those are definitely trickier beers, for us as brewers to really hone in and nail down. I think oftentimes a consumer who may not have any sort of brewing knowledge is just thinks it's an easier beer to make because it's less alcohol or whatever. Of course. Completely opposite from my perspective. But as far as hop blends go, I think, we're pretty familiar with a good chunk of varietals. There's a lot of stuff that we don't use. We've been a pretty heavy user of New Zealand hops since about 2018, which is when our relationship with Freestyle Hops started. We've been fortunate to be a part of hop selection down at their farm 2019, and most recently this year I was down there. There's just such a unique characteristic to all New Zealand hops, and then obviously individually as you start to dive into them. But I think our bigger focus lately has just been on, alternative hop products and trying to find or figure out how we can incorporate those. I'm kind of on the argument of like they're not supplements, but they're you want to incorporate them with something like a normal T90 pellet or a cryo pellet.
They're not replacements, but they
that was the word I was looking for.
They can add some extra character to it.
Yeah, so I mean, we've been more recently messing around with Freestyle's Sub-Zero Hop Keef, which is like a full cold side flowable hop product. I'm sure you're familiar with. Beer we have on tap right now, Chili Bin, is a New Zealand style pilsner that's Nelson Nectaron and Nelson Sub-Zero Hop Keef. We're kind of finding that a product like it's adding a hop flavor and punch to it, but like the oil and mouth coating effect is something different that you may be not getting out of a T90 pellet, and maybe you're getting that a little bit from a cryo pellet. But I think there's some kind of a marriage between all the forms of hops that you can find cool balance with.
So you actually need some of that vegetal and polyphenol type character then.
I think so, yeah.
How, as you're doing it now, how do you balance some of those things? If you're using some of, whether it's intense cryo or, something like the hop keef, how do you think about layering in some of that in a different format? You doing 50-50 blends? You leaning one way or another? Obviously, these are more intense in terms of character, but
I mean, we're still.
And is there a time? Were you only talking about dry hop here, whirlpool? Are there some that work better in different kinds of timing than others?
So the Sub-Zero Hop Keef, we have only used basically about mid-fermentation dry hop. Freestyle recommends that is added below 140 degrees. We've never trialed. Oh, that's not true. We trialed once dosing it completely cold side, like as a dry hop addition, essentially in a bright tank. We took. I
mean, you are here in San Diego, and North Park's only a few blocks away here.
We took our Mexican style lager and dosed it with a small amount of the Matueka Freestyle Sub-Zero Hop Keef to kind of, give it that, like, we added a lime to your beer, but we didn't add a lime to your beer characteristic.
Right, yeah.
Turned out pretty cool. That was the only application where we added it completely post-fermentation. Anything else we've done has been hoppy style beers, typically adding it on day 3 or 4 of fermentation. Like you said, it's not a replacement product for us. We're still going to be heavy on 290 and cryo. We kind of observe cryo as, we're going to use it at about half the rate we would with T90. Freestyle supplies these bottles at a 275 ml or an 1100 milliliter bottle, but basically it's equatable to 11 pounds or 44. We're adding it in as if it was just an extra 11 pounds on the dry hop we were already doing. So, something like Chili Bin was technically dry hopped at a slightly higher rate than maybe some of our other beers might have been. But that was just out of, pure curiosity to see what that product could bring to the table.
Sure. Chili Bin, McElhenney collaboration, right?
Yes.
Sure.
One of two. Yeah, we had a blast brewing a few beers with Sean. Did some fun beer week stuff. So a couple at our place and one at his place.
Nice. Well, I want to talk a little bit about, we should still dive into dry hopping because we haven't fully talked about fermentation and dry hopping. You talked about, timing there, and now, but let's talk about on West Coast IPA, Carlsbad Crush. What's the dry hop look like on that?
That's all mosaic, and it is dry hopped pretty much consistently on day 5. We kind of found day 5 was the optimal time for harvest, but still with a little bit of activity left.
So it's day 5 because you can pull yeast off on day 5,
Yes.
and then you can just dry hop it after you've pulled the yeast off.
Yeah.
And it all works together as a process.
Yeah, that's our main goal is, finding that optimal time of let's make sure we can reuse yeast when and if we need to, and, get those hops in there when it's still slightly active at the warm side of the tail end of fermentation.
And how many points away from you are you from terminal when you start doing that?
1 at the most.
Right.
Part of it's a safety thing, and we're not trying to geyser or anything, which luckily
Sure.
hasn't happened. But
And you're just using Cali L yeast. Do you do you lower temperature at all before you dry hop, or are you just going in at that current fermentation temperature?
yeah, we're going in at 70. Dry hop temp is something we've played with a lot over the years, but I'd say for the last several years now has consistently all been warm side.
No real benefit from dropping the temperature down for you. Or raising it up for that matter.
Yeah, we're not really going above 70. For the hazy beers that we want a little bit more of that fruity ester profile, we're at like 72 or 73.
Right.
Different yeast strains, so it's going to act a little different. But we trialed a lot with like certain varietals at certain temperatures. So Trivana, going back to Trivana, for example, for a long time, the Mosaic was always warm, day 5. We would wait to pass VDK. We would set it down to 50. We would dump, and we would do the Amarillo dry hop, and then we would run a recirc on the tank. We've kind of gotten away from that. I almost felt like the Amarillo, like it gave it a little bit more of an old school profile, which, I mean, for me, I didn't mind it too much. But I think the Amarillo warm has brought a little bit more of the like orange and tangerine out, at least from our crop. And it's also brought a little bit more of an ease and a quicker process to the dry hopping process for us. It seems like we've been able to cut a couple days down by just getting it all in one charge and wait until it passes VDK and then moving along. Nelson was another one that we trialed a lot with at lower temperatures. We do a beer called Clever Kiwi, which we've been making for years. And, I guess unbeknownst to us at the time, it was kind of like a New Zealand Pilsner. We were dropping that beer down to 50 for dry hop. And we just really, really liked the New Zealand or the Nelson character we were getting on that beer.
Really?
So that kind of translated into the beers the IPA beers we were doing that had Nelson in them. So whether if it was only Nelson or if it was Nelson and 2 or 3 other varietals, the other varietals would go in first. We'd pass VDK, we would step it to 50, we would dump hops, get the Nelson charge in, and then run a recirc on the tank. And I think maybe looking back on it now and just having more experience with all of it, it could have been crop dependent, but it seemed like at the time we were getting a little bit less of that like diesel dank out of the Nelson and a little bit more of the fruitiness, which was what we were going for. But now I'd say for the most part, everything's getting dry hopped on the warm side with a little bit of fermentation left.
Sure. What's your, what do these typically then finish at? It's just, it's Cali L yeast, so it's going to be in that, 2 range?
Yeah, so the lower alcohol beers, we try to get them not to dry out quite as much. Again, just going back to trying to find that balance and create the drinkability. Something like Crush, we target about 2 Plato. The West Coast IPAs, we're at about 1.5. I'd say our standard range is 1.4 to 1.7 is pretty much what we're falling into for most things. West Coast Pilsners, we're about 2 Plato range. Although we did do a rebrew of our Highland Park collab, which was called Park Pass. Used a yeast strain that, wasn't unfamiliar to us, but it wasn't something that we had in our cellar, often over the last several years. So we were targeting a little bit higher of a terminal on that one. And, that was kind of us, going by what Bob's experiences have been and, what he likes to target and enjoying drinking his beers and just trying to learn from him. But, yeah, that one was at about 2.5 Plato, so not a drastic.
Was that a 3470 or was that?
That was a 3470, okay. Yeah. And,
I figure if it's Bob, it's got to be that.
Yeah, the beer turned out fantastic and, kind of opened us up to wanting to experiment a little bit more with that one.
As we finish up here, let's talk a little bit more about West Coast Pilsner. Just, as you define it, how do you find the right kind of balance between pungent West Coast hops, these kind of hops that we all have an expectation around via IPA, and building balance within, this kind of light Pilsner structure, which isn't always light. I shouldn't say that it's always light. There are plenty of Pilsner beers. In fact, the original Pilsner beer, Pilsen, really not necessarily a light beer in that sense. Kind of a golden, rich beer. As you define it now, knowing that your West Coast audience here in San Diego wants very pale and light-bodied Pilsner beer, how do you build the right kind of balance and find that balance with these pretty intense West Coast hops?
I guess I started with like somewhat of a pale ale approach.
Yes.
I mean, pale ale is my favorite
I've been
beer
trying
style.
to popularize cold pale ale.
Yeah,
And,
I mean, I think, ultimately, that's
thank you for
probably
admitting
more
it.
what
Thank
we're
you for
like
admitting it.
making.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, pale ale is my favorite beer category, like hands down. So a lot of the West Coast Pilsner beers we've done have been a blend of two-row and some sort of Pilsner malt.
Sure.
Just touching back on Park Pass with Highland Park, we did a two-row and Wireman Barca Pils blends. And I believe a little bit of Carafoam on that as well. So still trying to have a balanced body. We're not lagering those beers, as I don't think really anyone is.
Right. You don't want to destroy all of this hop character that you just worked so hard to work into it.
Yeah, and I think,
It also doesn't necessarily need that kind of polishing in order to...
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the approach, I think it's okay to be, approaching it differently than, you don't have to be like, oh, I'm using lager yeast, I have to do it the way I'm going to do my Pilsner. So, we never took that approach. We kind of just felt like, well, we're going to blast this thing with who knows what hops at the same rate we're going to dry hop a pale ale or an IPA with. So, does it quite need the polishing? Probably not. So there's still like a 3 to 4 week beer for us, like our normal hoppy stuff is. We've kind of ran the gamut a little bit on yeast strains. So in-house, we always have Augustiner and we always have Mexican lager yeast. So we kind of started with those two. Augustiner was a little too estery for my liking with these West Coast Pilsners, so we had switched it to Mexican lager yeast, which is a little bit more clean and neutral. I've been a big fan of the beers we've done, the West Coast Pilsner beers we've done with that yeast strain. And then most recently brought 3470 into the mix and was really happy with the results of that as well. I think just for the sheer fact that we have Mexican lager in-house all the time, we probably will stick with that for most of these beers. But it's clean, but it also, I think if you know beer and you can at least tell the difference between drinking a lager and an ale, you will know that we fermented the beer with a lager yeast. But yeah, we're dry hopping it at about 2.5 to 3 pounds per barrel, same as what we would our pale ales or IPAs.
It's intense.
We're still fermenting. We're starting the fermentation on the cold side and then ramping them up on I'd say they were landing around day 4 or 5. It just depends on where we're at with fermentation. But then getting dry hopped on the warm side, which warm side meaning probably 62 degrees.
Sure. Now your Pilsner yeast, your lager yeast in general, is going to likely produce a little more sulfur, than your Cali Ale yeast.
Yes.
How do you balance, say that sulfur contribution from the fermentation, against some of the kind of sulfur compounds in the hops themselves? Do you think about that, and do you try to, alleviate that in any way?
Yeah.
Or amplify that,
So I think 3470 probably produced a little bit more sulfur than the other two strains that we were more familiar with. Augustiner seems to be a pretty low sulfur producer, and then Mexican lager, I think, is even less of a sulfur producer, at least the strain we're using particularly. So, I don't know if we just got kind of lucky and the beers that we've done so far haven't had too many sulfur issues. There's ways you can go about scrubbing it out using some copper scrubs.
I didn't mean to imply sulfur issues. I love a good sulfur, character.
Yeah. I know what you
my
mean.
lagers. So, I wasn't implying it was bad. I'm just curious how you think about balancing those kinds of things.
Yeah. And I think, one of our brewers is, he's a little more sensitive to sulfur than I am, because there have been at least 2 West Coast Pilsners in the last, 3 months or so. And he's like, well, I kind of had to give it a week or two. It was a little, I was picking up some sulfur on that. I'm like, really? And it always kind of bums me out or something if I'm not picking it up. But then he'll come to me a couple days later and he's like, I don't know, maybe I was wrong. And I'm like, well, I don't think you were wrong. It could have changed in that few day period. Who knows?
Sure.
Luckily, there are some remedies if we're experiencing, over than desired levels of sulfur at the time of packaging. That's, I think, what I'm kind of finding with that Mexican lager strain is it's pretty clean and neutral and easy to work with. And, the other benefit for us incorporating more of these West Coast Pilsner style beers is just getting able to bounce the yeast around more and keep it going and keep it lively, and
Sure. Well, let's zoom out here as we finish up. You all have been at it for a number of years now. Where do you hope to be with Burgeon for the next 3 years, the next 5 years? You've got multiple locations in San Diego now. You've got some GABF metal, 3 GABF metals to your name. What's next for you from a brewing or a business standpoint? And what do you hope to achieve? Where do you hope Burgeon to be in the next 3 to 5 years?
We're in the midst of working on our 5th location, another tap room location. So, for us, it's always been a focus to grow the business from within as much as we can. We do thoroughly enjoy bringing on people that are great assets to the company, and we've been fortunate to do that up to this point. We're completely self-distributed. Most of our beer stays in San Diego County. So for us to grow the distribution and sales team that we have is, I feel pretty proud of. It's a pretty tough and difficult thing to manage on your own, and not a lot of people have been fortunate doing it. I think, we've established a very solid lineup of core beers. The fresh and new is something we've always put focus and emphasis on, and I don't see that going anywhere. It's been a great thing to incorporate into our business model for not only our in-house customers, but our out-of-house customers as well. I think we're getting to the point with the equipment we have where it's becoming a little more difficult to experiment with things. There's always a constant need for, I need another tank of this or that, so it kind of pushes things to the wayside. But we've got a couple things that we're looking at doing next year in-house and getting some equipment in to allow us to continue experimenting, continue trying out new products, trying to stay relevant. I mean, there's just so many people out there that want what's new and what's next, and we're fortunate to have the loyal customer base with the core beers as well. But I think our focus is it has been and will remain San Diego. Like, there's so much room in this landscape here. It sounds crazy to say that because there are so many breweries here, but we feel like we have a great product. We feel like there's a lot of great things to get behind with our company, and we have a great team. Our team is why we are where we are, and we continue hiring the right people and growing within this landscape. I think we'll be just fine in the next few years.
Well, that sounds like a great place to bring this to a close. Just a reminder, choose G&D Chillers on your next expansion or brewery startup and receive 1 free year of remote control and monitoring. ProBrew's engineering team prides itself on providing true customized turnkey solutions. Try Old Orchard's newest flavors like Berry Blend, Blood Orange, Lemonade, and Tart Cherry, or have their R&D team formulate a custom blend just for you. Omega Yeast's Diacetyl Knockout Series is comprised of 8 familiar yeast strains engineered to knock out the formation of diacetyl before it starts. ABS Commercial are proud to offer brewhouses, tanks, keg washers, and preventative maintenance parts to brewers across the country. SS Brewtech is dedicated to an engineering-first approach to brewery equipment and powers R&D at some of the world's greatest breweries. Christian Hansen's Smart Bev range of frozen liquid yeast and freeze-dried bacteria allows for consistent performance and high quality. And don't miss the 2024 California Craft Beer Summit, March 12th through 14th in Sacramento. And of course, if you've enjoyed this episode and any other episodes of the podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, show us that this content matters to you, and we depend on your support to keep bringing it to you week after week after week. Reminder, we've got a Brewery Accelerator event for breweries and planning coming up in Austin, Texas this March. If you are considering opening a brewery or on your path to do that, or if you've just opened a brewery, go to breweryworkshop.com and check out the information about that event. Anthony, if you want to learn more about Burgeon and the beers you make, West Coast Pilsners, West Coast Pale Ales, West Coast IPAs, and all the other things that you also make too, where can they learn more about you, both in real life and out there on the internets?
Yeah, so main brewery and taproom locations in Carlsbad. We have Burgeon at the Oasis in Escondido. We have Burgeon at the Arbor, which is where we are right now, downtown.
With a hopping afternoon crowd here, I might add. Yeah,
not too bad for a nice Wednesday. And then we have a private event space known as the Greenhouse, which is located in the same building as the brewery in Carlsbad. And then soon to be Burgeon at the Grove in Vista, California. You can find us at burgeonbeer.com or Instagram at burgeonbeer.
Well, I appreciate you talking with me about brewing beer today, Anthony. It's been wonderful talking about it. Cheers.
Thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.